40,000 people are screaming his name. Rome has never seen anything like it. A general rides through the city in a golden chariot, dressed as a god, crowds throwing flowers at his feet, captured treasure paraded behind him for miles. This is, without exaggeration, the single greatest day of his life. And standing directly behind him, close enough to touch, is a slave whose only job is to lean in and whisper 4 words into his ear over and over for the entire parade. You're going to die. Not a threat, but a requirement. Because the Romans understood something most powerful people today have forgotten. The moment you convince yourself you're untouchable is exactly the moment you become dangerous to everyone, including yourself. And Rome wasn't alone. Across the ancient world, from Babylon to China to the frozen assemblies of Scandinavia, entire civilizations built the same insurance policy into the heart of power itself. Kings were slapped. Emperors were mocked to their faces on purpose. Pharaohs, worshipped as living gods, still had to prove they could physically run. This is the story of how, again and again, ancient cultures found brutal, brilliant ways to make sure their most powerful people and never forgot they were still just people. Chapter 1. The Roman Triumph Whisperer. In ancient Rome, a victorious general returning from war was honored with a triumph, an extravagant parade through the city, complete with cheering crowds, captured treasure, and a chariot ride reserved for the single most celebrated man in Rome. Yet according to several surviving historical accounts, a slave rode in the chariot directly behind the general throughout the entire procession, holding a laurel crown above his head and repeating a single phrase into his ear again and again. Memento mori. Remember, you are mortal. At the exact moment a man might reasonably believe himself godlike, Roman tradition installed a constant, unwelcome reminder of his own mortality directly at his shoulder. Historians still debate exactly how widespread or literal this specific practice actually was, but the underlying cultural instinct it represents, undercutting triumph with mortality, appears repeatedly throughout Roman tradition, in funeral processions, in private correspondence, and in the philosophical writings of the era. Even a man riding through cheering crowds at the absolute peak of public glory was not permitted to fully forget that his own death remained ultimately inevitable and unremarkable. Chapter 2. Licensed Fools and Court Jesters. Court jesters and licensed fools appear across a remarkable range of ancient and medieval cultures, from Europe to China to various African kingdoms, occupying a genuinely unique social position. Unlike virtually anyone else in a royal court, a jester could mock the ruler directly, point out uncomfortable truths, and openly criticize royal decisions, all without facing punishment. This wasn't simple entertainment. Rulers who surrounded themselves exclusively with flattery risked losing touch with reality entirely. And a licensed fool served as a uniquely protected pressure valve, someone whose criticism could be dismissed as mere jest if it stung too sharply, yet still meaningfully heard. Several historical accounts describe jesters offering genuinely sound political advice, disguised carefully as jokes, occasionally influencing significant royal decisions from a position that carried absolutely no formal power whatsoever. Some jesters became genuinely beloved figures, remembered centuries later specifically for their wit, while others were quietly dismissed the moment their honesty stopped feeling amusing and started feeling simply true. The role required a genuinely delicate balance, close enough to power to be heard, sharp enough to matter, yet never so threatening that the ruler felt genuinely, dangerously exposed. Chapter 3. The Babylonian Ritual Slap. In ancient Babylon, the New Year festival known as Aki-2 included a startling ritual specifically designed to humble the king before an entire assembled crowd. The high priest would strip the king of his royal regalia, symbolically slap him across the face, and forcefully pull his ears, all before demanding the king kneel and swear he had not neglected his sacred duties throughout the previous year. If the king's eyes reportedly filled with tears during this ordeal, it was interpreted as a genuinely favorable sign, proof that the gods still favored his continued rule for another year. A king who remained dry-eyed and unmoved throughout the ceremony was considered a deeply troubling omen, a warning that his rule might not survive the coming year intact. This remarkable ritual meant that once every single year, the most powerful man in Babylon was forced to kneel, weep, and be physically struck in full view of his own subjects, regardless of any military victories or wealth accumulated throughout the preceding 12 months. Chapter 4. Saturnalia and Role Reversal Festivals. Roman Saturnalia, an enormously popular winter festival, temporarily inverted the entire social order for several days each year. Slaves were permitted to speak freely to their masters, sometimes even receiving genuine service in return, while normal social hierarchies were deliberately suspended throughout the city. Although Saturnalia primarily targeted everyday social hierarchy rather than the emperor specifically, the underlying cultural message still carried real weight. The current social order was not considered natural, permanent, or beyond question. Similar temporary role reversal festivals appear across numerous other ancient cultures throughout history, suggesting a widely shared belief that societies genuinely benefited from periodically loosening rigid, unquestioned social structures, if only for a few symbolic days each year. Even emperors were expected to participate in the festival's general spirit of informality, hosting looser, more relaxed gatherings that stood in sharp contrast to the rigid formality expected throughout the rest of the year. Chapter 5. China's Remonstrance Officials. Ancient China developed something remarkably close to an entire formal institution specifically built around criticizing the emperor. Remonstrance officials held a real, recognized position within the imperial bureaucracy, specifically tasked with pointing out the emperor's mistakes and openly advising against unwise policy decisions. This was genuinely dangerous work. Some remonstrance officials were executed for speaking too bluntly. Yet the institution itself persisted for centuries across multiple dynasties, reflecting a deeply held belief that even an emperor benefited from formal, sanctioned criticism. Confucian political philosophy specifically praised officials willing to risk their own lives by speaking uncomfortable truths to power, and several officials achieved considerable lasting historical fame specifically for their documented willingness to challenge imperial decisions, sometimes recorded in official histories precisely because their warnings, ignored at the time, later proved painfully accurate. Chapter 6. The Pharaoh's Proof of Strength. Ancient Egyptian pharaohs, despite being widely considered living gods among their own people, still had to periodically prove their continued fitness to rule through an elaborate ceremony known as the Sed Festival. Traditionally held after roughly 30 years on the throne, the ceremony required the pharaoh to perform a series of demanding physical and ritual tasks specifically designed to demonstrate that his strength and vitality genuinely remained intact. This included a symbolic ritual run across a marked ceremonial course while being closely observed by assembled priests and nobles. A pharaoh who visibly struggled during this test could face serious, sometimes existential, questions about his continued fitness and legitimacy to rule. Divine status alone, it turned out, was never quite considered sufficient. Physical proof was still expected and required. A reminder that even a god-king remained bound by the same aging body as everyone else in his kingdom. Some historians believe that in earlier, more distant periods of Egyptian history, a pharaoh who genuinely failed this test might have faced consequences considerably more severe than mere public embarrassment. Chapter 7. Sparta's Check on Royal Power. Ancient Sparta developed one of history's most genuinely unusual checks on royal power, an elected board of 5 officials known as ephors, who held real, substantial authority over Sparta's own kings. The ephors could formally put a Spartan king on trial, impose meaningful fines, and in certain extreme circumstances, even have a king removed from power entirely. Sparta famously maintained 2 kings ruling simultaneously, and the ephors served as a crucial check specifically designed to prevent either one from ever accumulating too much unchecked personal power. This institutional arrangement meant that even in a deeply militaristic society, built almost entirely around unquestioned discipline and obedience, the king himself was still subject to real, meaningful oversight from ordinary elected citizens, elected annually from among the general Spartan citizenry, rather than from any hereditary noble class. Chapter 8. Norse Assemblies and Rule by Consent. Among the Norse and other Germanic peoples, chieftains and even kings ruled with power that depended heavily on regular public assemblies known as things, gatherings where free men could voice grievances, settle disputes, and directly challenge decisions made by their leaders. A chieftain who ruled poorly, broke established custom, or lost the confidence of assembled free men risked open, public rejection at these gatherings, sometimes losing his position entirely as a direct result. This wasn't formal democracy in any modern sense, but it reflected a genuinely widespread belief across Northern Europe that leadership required ongoing consent rather than simply inherited or seized authority. Icelandic sagas preserve numerous accounts of chieftains publicly challenged, shamed, or outright deposed at these assemblies, suggesting that even in a famously warrior-driven culture, raw strength alone was never considered quite sufficient to rule unchallenged. A leader's authority, in other words, had to be renewed again and again in full view of the very people he claimed to command, rather than simply assumed to last forever once granted. None of these humbling rituals and institutions were designed to genuinely weaken the powerful or to seriously undermine legitimate authority itself. They serve a more subtle, precise purpose, reminding those who held power that authority was fundamentally a responsibility, not merely a personal possession to be wielded without any consequence. Whether through a single whispered phrase, a ritual slap delivered once a year, or a formal institution built specifically around structured criticism, ancient cultures across the world independently arrived at remarkably similar conclusions. Power left completely unchecked tends to corrupt, and even the most powerful ruler benefits from being reminded, regularly and deliberately, that they remain human. Many of these specific practices have faded from the world entirely, but the underlying impulse behind them has not disappeared, resurfacing today in different forms, through elections, through a free press, through public accountability of every kind. If you found this look into how ancient cultures humbled their most powerful leaders as fascinating as we did, consider subscribing for more buried and forgotten stories from history.